Everybody, just before we get started with the show here, I want to make a quick shout out to the good folks at Springs Homes for supporting Studio 809 and this podcast. They're in the business of real estate because they love helping clients achieve their goals. Competitive, collaborative, and trustworthy. Meet the real estate pros at springshomes.com.
This is Studio 809.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Outdoors with Hiking Bob podcast. I am your host, Hiking Bob Falcone. You can find me on my website, hikingbob.com, with links to my social media, my column at the Colorado Springs Independent, all the other podcasts I've done, my photography website, you name it, it's there. You can even contact me, sign up for my newsletter, read the other previous newsletters, all that stuff is at hikingbob.com. Today with me is my co-host, Kevin Wild Westendorf.
Hey everyone, Wild Westendorf here, and you can find me on my website, wildwestendorf.com, and on all the socials, but primarily Facebook and Instagram at Wild Westendorf.
Cool. And I want to just make a note to people who read the show notes for this podcast. I used to have a link to like all the different places that you could find the podcast, and now I found out there's one place you can go to called Podlinks. So there's just a link to that now, and you go there and it has every place listed that the podcast is available.
Oh, cool.
So look for that in the show notes. It's actually a whole lot easier than me trying to post every single one of those. One of those places. So that is available there. And Kevin, I think the topic for today is going to be the TPL, Trust for Public Land, ParkScore. Ranking. And you and I have talked about that over the last couple of podcasts, and we've had questions about how they come to that score and why our ranking has changed and things like that. And to be fair, some of that comes from what I was told from people in the parks department, things like that. So they reached out to me. And just this, about 2 hours before we were recording this, I actually had a very long, probably close to an hour conversation with two people from the Trust for Public Lands, a Will Klein, who kind of in charge of this ranking system, and Kirsten Mickow, who was she was in charge of what she called the spatial part of things, looking at the land mass and stuff like that, how much stuff we have. And I know that I'm missaying what she does, but basically she was the one who knew where our parks were and open spaces were and how much land they were and how big they were and stuff like that. So that was kind of her thing. So I had a long list of questions and we discussed that. So I'm just it was recorded, but it wasn't recorded for the podcast. So I have a recording of it so I can go back and refer to it. But we had some questions about it. Like I was told open space doesn't count. I was told that only city parks counted. I was told that porta potties don't count, but a pit toilet would. It turns out that is not entirely all very accurate. The other question I had was, why do we keep dropping in rankings? Why are we being ranked? Why aren't we just being graded? All these kind of questions we had. So I'll go over a couple things really quick. So first thing is, open spaces do count. Sort of.
Okay.
And here's the sort of. They rank things as whether it's an open space. They rank acreage. How many acres of land do you have? Toward that measurement, open space obviously does count. There's some caveats there. I'll go into them in just a second. They also rank parks. Now, parks are parks. They're like, I have two of them in my neighborhood here. They're places with tennis courts or basketball courts or a swimming pool or a baseball field
and a playground.
And a playground, exactly that. So obviously, an open space doesn't count as a park because it's not a park. An open space, by definition, is a place with a parking lot, trailheads, and a lot of trails, but it doesn't have all those other amenities. So obviously, if you say that open space doesn't count, it does count towards how much land we have, obviously.
Okay.
But it's not going to count as a park. It also does count to their 10-minute measurement. How many, is it a place within 10-minute walking distance of, they measure how many people are within a 10-minute walking distance of a park or an open space. It does count toward that 10-minute
Okay.
measurement. So I got that clarified because I was told open spaces don't count. Well, not exactly. Now, there are some, as with anything else, there are some ifs and buts and things like that. Bear Creek Regional Park is a county park. It lies entirely within the city limits of Colorado Springs. You live almost right across the street from it.
Yep.
It does count towards a park that is within 10-minute walking distance.
Okay.
Of about, from what they told me, I think 4,000 people. So a pretty sizable chunk of people. It does count, even though it's not a city park. It is a county park. Now, of course, if you understand your politics and your tax bill, we live in the city. We still pay county property tax. Well, obviously, if we live in the city, it goes towards that park.
Yeah.
Makes sense, right? So, Blodgett Open Space. We had thought Blodgett Open Space doesn't count. Well, it does. There are thousands of people within a 10-minute walking distance of Blodgett Open Space. There are thousands of people within 10-minute walk of Red Rock Canyon Open Space. There are a lot of people within a 10-minute walking distance of a lot of. I asked why a 10-minute distance, and it was just, to be honest, it was kind of arbitrary. They had to pick a number. 10 minutes seemed like a good number. Now, there are some issues with that. For example, there are a lot of people within 10 minutes of Red Rock Canyon Open Space that are not in the city of Colorado Springs.
True, yep.
The people to the west are in Manitou Springs. They do not count as a population that enjoys our park. Blue Stem Prairie Open Space on the as far opposite as you can get from Red Rock Canyon, pretty much, has a small neighborhood that is in the city and butts right up against Blue Stem Prairie. Those people count as being within a 10-minute walking distance of Blue Stem Prairie. But if you go to the south end of Blue Stem Prairie, and there's a trailhead there, so that's access. Everybody south of there is not in Colorado Springs. They're in unincorporated up there, basically security and stuff like that.
Yeah.
They do not count as a population that is within 10 minutes because they're not within the city limits.
Okay.
I kind of argued a little bit with that.
Yeah, that's kind of BS, I think.
Well, and to be fair, they said, well, we had to draw a line someplace. I said, well, if you're judging, and this is where it gets to be in the weeds, and I understand why they don't want to get this deep into the weeds, because then when you start making exceptions, it gets very confusing. I said, Blue Stem Prairie and Red Rock Canyon Open Space are purchased with TOPS money. They're TOPS properties. They're purchased with TOPS funds. TOPS funds are sales tax. People in Manitou Springs and also down in Security Whitefield probably spend a lot of money in Colorado Springs. Ergo, they help support the taxes that create the TOPS fund that buys those properties. They should count.
Yeah.
That's probably not going to change. And to be fair, I get why. I mean, if you start making exceptions for who pays for what, it gets to be crazy. But I'm not sure if that hurts us any, but it certainly doesn't help when the sizable populations are not included in the people who use your park.
I can see that getting messy and confusing for larger cities, like large metro areas. Because then you have Denver, which is right next to Aurora, and if you have parks along there, then if you count everyone in Aurora, which I believe is the second largest city in the state, it's the second or third.
Well, we're second.
Okay.
They're going to be third.
And so that's going to pump up the numbers dramatically.
Right.
Where here, if you include that neighborhood in Manitou Springs west of Red Rock, it's going to increase the numbers, but not hugely.
It's a few hundred people that are probably within 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe 1,000 at the most. But in Security Whitefield and Blue Stem Prairie, that's a sizable, dense population right across the street from that south entrance to the park. You're right, though. And I get their points. Well, where do we stop making exceptions and drawing lines and things like that? I say, well, okay, I get it. But they appreciated the point I was trying to make. There was an issue where if the city owned the land, but it wasn't within the city limits, it did not count.
Okay.
Now, that affects us a little bit here, but not a whole lot. For example, Corral Bluffs Open Space and Jimmy Camp Creek Park are owned by the city, but they're not I think they might be now annexed into the city, so they're technically within the city limits. But they don't count anyway because they're not open to the public.
Yeah.
That's fair. If you're not going to have access, you can't say, well, we have a park out there, but you can't go in it. Well, it's not a park. Nobody cares. You can't go.
Yeah.
And there's some complications. It may be a very long time before either one of those opens. So there are some things, and once we were made aware of, it has to actually be within the city limits, that the city, my understanding is they're working with legal to formally access property or formally annex property that we own, but it's not actually within the city limits. And, we're the only property owner, so it's just a matter of passing an ordinance to, annex that. Not like if it's a populated area and you've got to annex people and change things. So some of that is some of the issues. So some of that's been addressed. So now I understand that a little better. Yeah, an open space doesn't count for a park. Okay, it's not a park, but it does count for the acreage. It does count for who's within 10 minutes of something.
Okay.
It does count for that. Also, our trails and greenways that connect places do count. Oh. If they're dedicated, if it's a sidewalk along a street, that's not going to count. It's a sidewalk. But like here near where I live, this Temple of the Gap spillway that runs basically from the trails on the west side of I-25 all the way to Palmer Park. That actually counts because it's a park type or amenity, open space type amenity, and it's not next to a road, so it's not a sidewalk next to a road. So that counts as some of your open space. The Pikes Peak Greenway along the Monument Creek counts as as some type of open space property, and that's within 10 minutes of a lot of people. It's within 10 minutes of downtown. So now that I'm understanding this a little better, it's beginning to make a little bit of sense. Now, the issue of bathrooms came up. This was a fun topic. And we are correct. If you put in a pit toilet, a permanent facility, you get credit, whatever the credit is, for having a bathroom facility. If you put in a line of porta potties, you do not. I said, well, that's not exactly fair. I said, have you seen what it costs to put in a bathroom? They're a fortune. They are hearing that argument from everybody.
Oh, okay.
We're not the only ones whining about the bathroom thing.
And plus, I know... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, they're hearing that from everybody.
Plus, I know one of the issues why there hasn't been a vault toilet put up in Cheyenne Canyon near Howland High Falls is the price is even steeper up there because they had to design the toilets to where it's protected from the creek.
I made that exact point, that thing would be 50 feet from a creek that's drinking water. So they don't want to put one in there. But we put in a bunch of porta potties, and I said we put more in the summer when we're busy, and we take some out in the winter when it's less busy. They're hearing that from a lot of people. Plus, the other thing is if you put in bathrooms, if you put in a real bathroom, you got to spend a bunch of money for water and sewage and run water line up there, run sewer lines out. Then you got to pay people to maintain them. And as we know, what's the first thing that gets cut when you have an economic downturn?
Parks.
Yeah. So what do? The first people who probably go are it's either the contracted people who are maintaining the bathrooms, which mean then your bathrooms get locked. Parks departments in cities say we don't want to be yelled at because the bathrooms are locked. So it's actually easier for us just to not put them in. Again, that goes back to funding. Whose fault is the funding? Well, it's not the Parks Department's fault. It is the elected officials' fault. So that explains the bathroom thing. I said, you've got to cut people a break on that. So it sounds like they're trying to find a way to make that work. For example, if you put in a concrete pad for your porta potties and put them in some kind of a shelter, you may get some type of points for that. And I'm not taking words out of their mouth. They're thinking of trying to find a way to get some type of credit for doing that, recognizing that it's a lot of money to put in a bathroom. Now, I've complained before that the city has this thing about not putting in bathrooms. It's even hard for them to go and put in porta potties. But that is the issue that they're trying to resolve. They've recognized they're expensive to put in, they're expensive to maintain, and that's the first thing that gets cut when there's economic downturn. People don't want to get yelled at because their bathrooms are locked.
Yep.
On the other hand, people are not happy when there's no bathroom. You got to do something. So, so there may be a way to work that that issue in, and that was the one topic that they've heard from everybody.
Okay.
About.
Okay.
So we're not alone.
Good.
They say, come on, cut us a break. That's one of the issues. So those are the big things that I had questions about. Now, why do we drop in ranking? I said, we're doing better. Why are we dropping ranking? Well, it's a ranking. It's not a grading. So we drop in ranking, not because we're doing any better. It actually said we've done better than we have in the previous year. It's just that everybody against us, and they termed the ranking system as a friendly competition.
Oh, of course, yeah.
I say nay. It's not. It's not. It shouldn't be a competition. But we have a disagreement. You know, I see where they're at. It's not so much that we're not doing. It's not so much that we're not doing better. We could be. It's just that the other top 100 cities in the country are just doing better than us. So that is really where I have an issue with the perspective of this.
Yeah.
Colorado Springs was, and I forget the number, was 40th. Now they're 53rd. They've dropped in ranking. But when you look into the numbers, have we actually done worse? No. We've actually done better. It's just that everybody else was spending more money or doing something.
Which is why it needs to be a grade, not a rank.
Right. So it's actually... the devil's in the details. So, of course, what does all the media do? We dropped in ranking. We're doing worse. Well, only when you compare us to everybody else. The other thing they do not take into account, because there's really no way to do that, is the wants and needs of the community. Now, the needs of our community are pretty high. We don't have enough parks. We don't have enough.
Yeah.
But what about the wants of the community? Is the community happy with having more open spaces than parks? Well, that requires, how do you figure that out? You take a poll. So that doesn't take into account. You could have a city, and this is not necessarily about Colorado Springs. You could have a city where the people said, we're happy with what we have. We don't want more parks, open spaces. We're happy with what we got. If other cities are doing more stuff, you're going to continue to drop in ranking, even though you're giving your people exactly what they want.
And it would be really, really hard to gauge that, especially the size of the springs being so huge. But because we're a very spread out, sprawling city, I guarantee you. Now, I'm speaking anecdotally, but from experience, from conversations I've had with friends, and just what I've seen. I would bet that the more core part of the city, like downtown and the west side, would want more and more open space and parks. And then you have the suburbs, which they probably don't value that as much and are fine with the park across the street.
Well, that would be true probably for the west side of town. The east side of town, as we know, it doesn't have as much parkland, and since it butts up against the county, there's not much open space. But I think your point is well taken. The other comment I made to them was you're comparing us to cities on the East Coast and West Coast that don't have open space. So of course they build more parks because they don't necessarily have open space, quote unquote open space. So we like our open spaces here. Now we like our neighborhood parks, and everybody likes them. If you're a family and you want to take a short walk to a park and take the kids out someplace, or you take your dog for a walk like I do here around a park, people appreciate that. But we really, in this part of the country, and I'm not just talking about Colorado or Colorado Springs, like our open spaces. We live near the forest and near the mountains for a reason. So we value things a little bit, I believe, speaking anecdotally like you mentioned, I believe we value these things a little differently than somebody in a very urbanized area that needs whatever they can get.
Yeah.
They may not be a half-hour drive from the forest and be able to go wherever they want. Also, on that note, I did note that I was told that if there's a connection from a city open space or park to Forest Service land, there is some accounting for that too.
Oh, okay.
So like Blodgett open space backs up to the National Forest. There's actually trail markers. They're now entering National Forest. North Cheyenne Canyon enters into the National Forest. So there are some accounts for that as being some of your land within a 10-minute walk. That counts.
Oh, that's cool. Okay.
So then I said you should probably regionalize your ranking. I said if you take Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, maybe Idaho, states along the Rocky Mountain spine
Yeah.
are going to be different than cities along the East Coast.
Very different.
So I said it would help to regionalize this, because when you put out these nationwide rankings, and by the way, the rankings are the top 100 cities in the country, population-wise. And believe it or not, Salt Lake City is not one of those. We would not be... Salt Lake City is not part of the ParkScore.
I thought it would be a bigger city than that.
Apparently not.
Okay.
Because I asked about Salt Lake City. There is a way to go into the Trust for Public Land website, and you could pick which states you want to create a ranking for, so to speak. And when you do that, all of a sudden Colorado Springs drops from middle of the pack to way up in the pack on some things and not so much on others. It's variable. So there is a way to parse out who you want to rate yourself against, who you want to rank yourself against. But you've got to do the homework to find it, which, again, when you release a news release in the top 100 cities in the country, Colorado Springs has fallen down to number 53. Nobody's paying attention to the fact you can dive deeper in there, and that was a point I made.
Exactly.
This needs to be announced differently. Now, whether they're gonna, they did ask what I had concerns about. They did ask my suggestions. I appreciated that. I don't know what they can actually will implement. Maybe they'll just say, "Well, Bob had his 2 cents worth, and we don't care." I don't know. I mean, and to be honest, they were very sincere. They really want to make this work. They're like anybody else. You don't want to have your work, I mean, this has got to be incredibly amount of hard work.
Oh, yeah.
You don't want to get beat up on because you missed something. So I think they were sincere that they want to find a way to make this work. I'm not crazy about the fact that we're ranked against other cities that have way more money and much bigger cities and have more resources. But it is what it is. But now that I understand it better, it makes a little more sense. Now, I'm still not 100% crazy about it. I don't like that porta potties don't count. I don't like that people who access our parks but are not within the city limits don't count. I'd like to see that change.
Yeah.
I like to see, what we used to call, I like to see brownie points for trying if we're doing better. The positive side of having a bad ranking and trying to make this work is it does put pressure on the city leaders, elected officials, to look at that and fund things better, which leads me to, I'm just going to touch on this briefly, the politics of next April. We're electing a new mayor, because Mayor Southers is term limited out. So far, there are 5 people running for that office. And we're going to be electing a 2, 3, 4 new city councilors. Sizable change in the leadership at the city. They now have something to campaign on, and people care about parks. So I'd like to hear what they think.
Oh, it's a good point.
So we'll see how that works when there's a lot of things going on. There's some question about the economy. We know inflation is kind of crazy. Most of that inflation is driven by fuel costs, which affect everything. We get fuel costs, and I'm not going to go into this long. I'm not an economist. I'm not a lot of things. Economist is not one of them. It's also one of those things I'm not. Economy, what was it back in the George Bush thing? It's the economy, stupid, when you want to know what people are worried about. So that's kind of where we're at now. In any case, that's the scoop with the TPL ParkScore ranking. I will send a link to 2 links they sent me, one of which tells you how they get these numbers and how they make these rankings. The other one will be how you can go in there and compare yourself to, say we compare ourselves to Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, and we just compare to the 4 corners. How do we rank there? Things change dramatically once you do that. So that makes a big difference in that. So it's an interesting... It was an interesting conversation. I really appreciated Will and Kirsten taking the time to spend about an hour with me talking about it, and they allowed me to ask a lot of probably dumb questions, but I had a list, and I appreciate them being pretty forthright with with their answers, and they really want to get this right. So I think this is still, even though it's been 10 years since this was created, they're still
fine-tuning
it, I think. And we'll see what happens next. So next May, it comes out again. And we'll see where we're at. But remember, if we go down, look at the details. That's the thing to look at. What are the details of your score? Did you actually do it? And actually, overall, one of the things they mentioned was overall, in the entire country, the percentage of people within 10 minutes of a park went up dramatically in a year.
I'm sure.
That's a good sign. We had to have something to do with that. So there you go.
Well, I really appreciate that they listened to the podcast in the first place. That's really cool. Thank you. And I really, really appreciate that they reached out and wanted to provide more clarity on the scores.
Yeah, I do too. And it's probably that we're not the only ones who have these questions. And we're fortunate, you and I, this podcast are fortunate to be an outlet that a lot of people probably have the same questions we did.
Yeah.
And they don't know who to ask. If you ask, depending what, no matter what city you're in, if you ask your park department staff, they may not really have all the answers, or they may not have time to address them and spend an hour with you. So we are fortunate that we were able to become kind of like a conduit for understanding this a little better. I still think I will say this, it is a flawed ranking, but I think it's nowhere nearly as flawed as I thought it was. And it's only flawed because I still have an issue with a couple of minor points.
Yeah.
Now that I get it, it's better. I just think we did say that on the last podcast that we thought his significance was a little overblown. I will say that is true if you don't take the time to delve into the details, and all you want to know is where you are on that 100 ranking. That if you're not looking at the details, did you actually do better, or did you fall only because the other places in certain key metrics did better than you?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you didn't do. That doesn't mean you actually did anything worse. You could have done a lot of things better. They could have just done a few things a little better and scored a little higher. That, I think, is the big message, and that's why I have a little bit of an issue with it. But I have less of an issue than I did 2 weeks ago.
Cool.
Now that we beat that horse to death, I hope everybody is interested in this. I mean, it matters a lot because this affects funding. This affects when it's time to fund our parks. This is one of those things that may put pressure on the elected officials to look at how they fund the Parks Department. One more side note about bathrooms. They did tell me that bathrooms are such a big deal that San Francisco actually passed a bond some years ago. I didn't ask how much it was. It couldn't have been less than millions and millions of dollars just to rebuild, refurbish, and install new bathrooms in their parks and open spaces.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So even a big city like San Francisco with a crap load of money, I imagine. I've seen the taxes in California. They don't have less money.
But still, there's the Bay Area. There's a lot of rich folks there.
Oh, yeah. Well, you had to be rich just to live there. But in any case, they had to even get a special bond just to pay for bathrooms, to give you an idea what they are. They're expensive. So I get it. And my word to them is give us credit for the porta potties, for crying out loud. A little bit of credit, something. And to be honest with you, if they want them on a concrete pad, concrete's cheap.
Yeah.
A little shelter to build over them and all that is a whole lot cheaper than building a bathroom and running plumbing and sewage and stuff like that. And those little pit toilets, those Forest Service pit toilets, they're ungodly expensive, and you got to dig a big hole in the ground, and you still got to maintain them. So there you go.
And you got to pay for someone to go out there, empty out the tanks, and which I imagine, especially at the Forest Service ones, when you're going to remote areas, I can imagine that is not cheap.
Yeah, it's got to be a small fortune. So there we go. Kevin, you and I did that hike down the Dixon Trail weekend before last. We talked about it last week, I think, briefly.
Yeah.
And a question came up on that hike, and you wanted to look into it a little more. So I'm going to let you just talk about the question that came up and what you found out.
So, along the trail, there were a bunch of cairns that were pointless. And if you don't know, a cairn it's a stack of rocks that someone has made by removing rocks from the area to create this stack. So I saw you, Bob. You knocked a few of them down because, especially the ones that could potentially be misleading. And we had briefly brought up the topic of leave no trace. And being an avid outdoors person for so many years, it's not something I really think about. I just, like, I know it. I get it. I don't question it. But my friend, who is not as much of an outdoors person, that joined us on this hike, he brought up a question where he couldn't understand why it was okay to alter the landscape to build a trail, but it's wrong for someone to put up a little stack of rocks. And I tried explaining to, because I've read in the past how cairns can be destructive, especially if you pull rocks out of creeks and such, and how they can be misleading, and how it really should be a forest ranger or a park ranger that sets them up on certain trails where it may be really tricky, especially on the 14ers, especially as you get above tree line, because you can't really build a trail on large boulders. And so I've seen cairns up there, which it's fine. I've seen cairns used in the desert before, when they can't really build a trail because it's bedrock. But then there's the pointless ones, and a specific example I'll bring up is Angel's Landing in Zion. If you look at photos, just type in Angel's Landing cairns, and you'll see there's an obnoxious amount of them up there. It aesthetically kind of messes with the view. I mean, it's a stunning view, but then you have all these dumb stacks of rocks just all over the place, and it doesn't do anything. And I know that's a way for someone to leave their mark and to say, like, hey, like, I did that. And but in reality, that does violate the leave no trace rules. And I think in terms of my friend's other part of the question about, like, why is it okay to alter a landscape, to put a scar on the mountain for a trail? And I think that's just, a lot of us like to be outside. We want to be in the mountains, but we want to do it responsibly. And I know this was not the case back in the day, but I know modern trail building is done much more mindfully, much more carefully, and it's designed in a way to where, yeah, you're putting a line in the ground, but these days it's done in a way to where it's the least impact on the rest of the area, the mountain, forest, desert. And where back in the day they would just carve a trail anywhere, and then, which leads to a ton of erosion and damage. It encourages other people to create different trails if it's not a well-made trail. And because I think it's important that we can go up into the mountains and experience the woods and nature. And it would be very, very destructive if we didn't have any trails up there in the first place, and everyone's just walking around creating their own trails. I think I get the point that my friend was trying to make, like the ethics and morals of it. Like, why is it okay to carve a trail into a mountain, but then someone stacks a few cairns somewhere, and that's wrong. And I think I've made a good case for it. When he did bring up the question at first, it caught me off guard a little bit, because it's not something I think about often, because it's ingrained in me.
Yeah, it was a good question, and I was like, well, I can come up with an answer, but we're kind of hiking on this trail, and that doesn't mean I didn't think it was a good question. And I'm glad that you did the research and looked at it. There is a ton of things out there about this. You're correct. When we build a trail, we are altering the landscape. But, you know, as you mentioned, modern trail building takes into account things like erosion. So it actually doesn't, if it's done right, which is why we don't like social trails or rogue trails, because they're not done right. They tend to go straight up hills and cut switchbacks and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's why we argue against those things, because they cause erosion, they cause more damage. So build trails, and I'll give you, there's a number of trails I can argue with you about that. The trail we were on, the Dixon Trail, look how well that held there. There were issues with trees down, but there wasn't much erosion on that trail.
No, it's a greatly designed trail.
The Mount Muskoka Trail, same thing. It's been there for a number of years. There's not a lot of erosion on that. That is held up extremely well because good modern trail techniques were used to build it. So are we altering the landscape when we build a trail? Yes, we are. You're not altering it in a way that's going to cause more damage over the long term. It's not going to erode. And I'll give you a hint. When you look at building a trail, the first thing it's all about water control.
Yeah.
Everything's about controlling the flow of water. That's what it's all about out there. So it was a good question. I have noticed in some spots in the western U.S., when they build rock cairns, they even build them where they encase them in like what I would call wire fencing.
I've seen that too.
Those.
Yeah.
So that they don't get knocked over and they don't get pushed over and they don't get scattered around and stuff like that. So they pile these rocks up, they wrap them in that wire fencing and anchor them to the ground, and they're permanent. In other places, like we did, in Cheyenne Mountain on the Dragon's Backbone Trail, where a rock cairn would work, we built those little arrows, and they're embedded into the rock, so we can find a way there. So there's a lot of things you can do, but that's why when you see rock cairns, me and many other people go over and kick them over because they're not supposed to be there.
Yeah,
because they may point you in the wrong direction, or they may. And it was one of the answers I did come up with was, well, wildlife needs those. They need those, insects and snakes and stuff like that need places to hide or live, and it's part of the ecosystem, which I guess is probably a minor part of that thing. The other part of the thing is just
don't.
Well, like you mentioned, I left my mark here. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
I don't want your mark left here. The only mark I want to leave here is you took a nice picture and you showed everybody. That's fine. I don't want your mark there. Nobody wants your mark there. Nobody cares.
Exactly.
You were there. Take a picture. Brag about it all you want, but don't leave a pile of rocks or graffiti or whatever the heck else. Nobody cares.
And I know you folks at home can't see this, but I brought up a picture to show Bob what the cairns look like on Angel's Landing.
Oh, man.
And, yeah, it's ridiculous.
Now, I wasn't there too many years ago, and there was none of that. So this is a recent...
It's a very new... I'm sure it was influenced by Instagram and stuff like that, but yeah. And I saw it the last time I was up there, and it's on a part of Angel's Landing that it's also starts to get curved, where it curves down.
Right. The part you don't want to slip off of.
Yeah. And I know a girl died a couple years ago from falling off of it, and I wouldn't be surprised if maybe she was trying to stack a cairn or something and just got too close to that edge.
I don't know the details, but I do know what you're talking about. That accident did happen. Yeah, let's not do that. Let's not pile up those rocks. Let's not be dumb. Nobody wants to leave your mark. Nobody cares. Your mark is you took your picture there and you got a selfie. Selfies are fine. As long as you don't do like they do at the Grand Canyon and walk off the cliff.
Oh, yeah.
But selfies are fine. Everybody, I go take a selfie when I go someplace. You want to show that you were there. You want something for yourself. You want something to share. That's fine.
Yeah.
When you leave the cairn, who cares? You're not there anymore. Nobody knows who put it. Just that some other idiot put up a pile of rocks here. Now somebody's got to go take them down and scatter the rocks around so the animals have them. And if you're digging them out of the ground to do it, you are causing erosion and damage to the ecosystem. So,
yep.
Am I soapboxed enough on this? I know I know you're not a fan of those things either. They're destructive. So.
I think it boils down to we do alter the landscape and stuff, but it's done responsibly, and it's the same way as when you drink. Alcohol is not good for you, but it's done responsibly. It can be a fun experience. You, especially with craft beer and stuff, it has all the different styles and flavors and types.
That's actually a good point.
But then if you overdo it, then it becomes a bad time for you.
I was out with a couple of people about 2 weeks ago now. We're looking at building a new trail. And I thought it was going to be a pretty simple build, a short trail. And as it turned out, when we went up there with people who were much more knowledgeable about the planning of a trail than I am, it turned out that it's going to be much harder than I thought. And we're going to have to remove a bunch of scrub oak and stuff like that. So now we took a step back and we're looking at this going, is this trail important enough that we need to put it in? That we need to do all this damage to the system?
Yeah.
To the those scrub oaks do a job, especially on this loose Pikes granite. They kind of hold mountains from falling down. So do we really need to build this trail? And that's the question we're now asking ourselves after seeing what it would take to build it. We're like, well, this is just kind of a fun trail. It doesn't really go anywhere. It's just going to be a place to look out and stuff like that. So do we need to build this? And part of that responsibility comes not only building it responsibly, but deciding if you really have to do it anyway. And maybe sometimes you don't.
Yeah.
But all that goes into consideration. So when you're asking about, are we displacing the environment? Are we altering the environment? One of the things besides good quality building is deciding whether you really need it or not, whether you need it in that spot or not, when we were plotting out the Mount Muskoka Trail, the place I had it going and the place it goes now were two way different things. But it turned out my idea was not a great one. That's why I brought in people who knew what they were doing and had them plan it out. And it turned out to be a much better idea. Anyway, I'm glad you brought it up, though, and I'm glad you did the research on it. Just another quick note, if you haven't heard, and you probably will by the time this comes out, Yellowstone National Park, all of it is closed. More than likely, they'll still be closed when this comes out. We're recording this on Monday evening. By Wednesday, it will probably still be closed due to massive flooding. And I've heard reports that there are roads washed away, bridges washed away. If you're planning on going to Yellowstone, you may want to think twice about it. You may want to check ahead. There's a very good possibility that's not going to happen for a while, because even if the rains and the flooding stops, they have to go back in and fix a lot of damage.
Yeah.
So pay attention to that. Mother Nature is just wanting to just kick our patooties this year. And if it wasn't wind and it wasn't heavy snow, now it's rain. So it's always something.
Of course, yeah.
Mother Nature always wins. Remember that. Mother Nature will always win, especially if we don't do anything about it. Kevin, do you have anything else you want to talk about today?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay. One last thing. I taught a wildflower photography class last weekend at Bear Creek Regional Park. It went over very well. I'm doing another one this coming weekend at Guard of the Gods Visitor Center. I will post a link to that. If you want to learn my little tips and secrets on how to take really cool wildflower photos, this is your chance to do it. So watch for that link in the show notes. If you are on my email list, you would have gotten that the last couple of emails. So you would see that there too. And if not, just go back and look for that. But teaching that, part of the proceeds from that, the small fee goes to the nature centers or the visitor centers and stuff. So it doesn't all go in my pocket. And that's all we got, Kevin.
Cool.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening.
And we'll talk to you later.
All right. Bye-bye.
Before you go, did you know you can rate and review our Studio 809 podcasts? That will help us, because our egos really need to have thousands and thousands of listeners. But that helps our wonderful sponsors reach more ears too. And we do love our sponsors. So just go to Studio 809 or any individual 809 podcast in your iTunes or podcast app and click on ratings and reviews. Thanks.